då ska vi gå vidare och vi ska stanna kvar en stund vid det strategiska innovationsprogrammet Metalliska material. Men vi ska blicka lite utanför CEPS. Vi ska titta på politik och policy som påverkar forskning i Sverige och Europa. Och för detta så skulle jag vilja bjuda Gert Nilson, programchef för Metalliska material, tillbaka upp på scenen. Ja. Välkommen tillbaka. Vi ska fortsätta kring metalliska material men som sagt blicka lite utanför. Och jag tänkte lämna ord och bild till dig.
Tack Maja. Ja, vi brukar... Oj, nu gjorde jag som jag inte skulle göra. Vi tänkte titta lite på hur det ser ut framåt. Det här är 8:e konferensen. Programmen är inne i sina sista faser. Det är visserligen flera år kvar, men vi behöver ändå lyfta blicken och titta lite framåt. Och en mycket viktig händelse för alla oss som arbetar med forskning och forskningssatsningar var ju naturligtvis att regeringen i december la fram sin forsknings- och innovationsproposition. Den lägger man vart 4:e år. Årets upplaga heter då Forskning, frihet, framtid, kunskap och innovation för Sverige. Och tittar man in i den så hittar man några viktiga saker. Vi har gjort ett litet urval här på punkter som är viktiga som vi tycker är viktiga för oss. Det ena är att man höjer anslagen till forskning. Näringslivet i Sverige har sagt att man bör höja anslagen till forskning med 1% av BNP för att ligga i fas med hur det var längre tillbaka i tiden och hur konkurrentländerna utvecklas. 75% av de pengarna ska näringslivet stå för och 25% vill man att det offentliga, staten, står för. Staten tog ett steg på den vägen genom att öka anslagen med ungefär 3,5 miljarder till offentlig forskning i forskningspropositionen. Så att vi har tagit ett steg på den vägen och det ser lovande ut framåt. Regeringen betonar också väldigt tydligt forskningens roll för omställning och konkurrenskraft. Näringsministern var med på presentationen, vilket är ovanligt. Det brukar bara vara utbildningsministern. Och det är ett tydligt tecken på att man också ser att forskning är viktigt för omställningen, för konkurrenskraften. En annan sak man betonade var att vi behöver titta forskningen framåt, behöver vara samhällsrelevant, den behöver alltså rikta sig mot våra viktiga frågor. Den behöver rikta sig mot ökad hållbarhet och framförallt då FN:s strategiska utvecklingsmål för 2030 och det vi kallar för Agenda 2030. Och som symboliseras av de här färgerna jag har på mig här och även Maja. Sist men inte minst så konstaterar man det som Rasmus nämnde i förbifarten, att utvärderingarna av de strategiska innovationsprogrammen har visat väldigt goda resultat. Programmen har varit framgångsrika och då säger regeringen att vi vill satsa vidare på strategiska innovationsprogram. Till och med mer än vi har gjort förut, vilket är naturligtvis intressant. Så att om vi fokuserar på det man då arbetsmässigt kallar CEP 2.0 så är det ändå några saker som kommer att förändra sig, menar man, mot de CEPar vi är inne på idag. Man pratar om ökade resurser. Det låter det bra. Men man säger samtidigt att det ska vara ett breddat uppdrag. Vi ska göra fler saker än vi gör idag. Man säger specifikt att vi ska hantera samhällsrelevans och hållbarhet bredvid konkurrenskraft. Uppdraget för de nuvarande CEParna är ju framförallt att stärka konkurrenskraften. Men nu ska vi även betrakta då samhällsrelevansen och framförallt omställningen till hållbarhet. Exakt vad det här är och hur det ska gå till, det vet vi inte än. Men diskussionerna har inletts och vi kommer att prata om det här väldigt intensivt de närmaste åren. Därutöver, om vi betraktar CEP 2.0 som en viktig framtidssatsning så har vi, precis som Maja sa, många andra satsningar. Vinnova har gått ut med en satsning på hållbar industri. Vi har industrins energi- och klimatomställning från Energimyndigheten. Där har vi även Industriklivet som ska hjälpa oss att ta bort CO2-utsläpp. Vi har precis i dagarna lanserat en vätgasstrategi och en IPK. Det vill säga projekt där man får åsidosätta statsstödsreglerna därför att de är av europeiskt intresse. Industrial projects of common European interest. Här har Energimyndigheten precis lagt fram sin strategi och vi får se vad som händer, men det kommer att vara en stor satsning, det utgår vi ifrån. I samma anda så kommer då någonting som heter Fonden för rättvis omställning, eller The Just Transition Fund, att rikta medel mot Sverige för industrins omställning. Det är också en alldeles ny satsning. Och vi har naturligtvis Horisont Europa som börjar komma igång med utlysningar på allvar. Så man kan konstatera att det är inte bara sipparna som växer, hela vårt fält växer. Engagemanget, intresset, finansieringen av den typ av forskning vi bedriver har blivit större. Och det man då kan konstatera är några saker. Vi står nu ungefär i samma situation som vi stod för 10-talet år sedan. Det vill säga vid vägval. I början på förra decenniet så diskuterade vi just hur innovationsprogrammens 1.0, hur de skulle se ut, vad det skulle bli. Och det vet vi ju idag. Vi står idag 8 år senare och vet ganska väl hur det blev. Nu är det dags att ta en ny diskussion. Det finns otroligt många satsningar som vi kan ta vidare. Det finns ett stort engagemang från regeringens sida, från samhällets sida, från hela EUs sida som vill att vi kommer framåt med omställning, med konkurrenskraft förstås, med samhällsrelevans. Och vi behöver bestämma oss för var vill vi vara. Vi kanske måste lyfta blicken och titta 10 år framåt. Hitta de människorna, de tankarna som beskriver vad är det för samhälle, vad är det för industri, vad är det för verksamhet vi kommer att bedriva om 10 år och vilka mått och steg måste vi ta nu för att ta oss dit. Den diskussionen blir viktig igen. Den som vi förde för ungefär 10 år sedan också sagt då, vi behöver gå tillbaka dit. Och en sak man kan konstatera i sammanhanget är ju att man kan inte uppleva hållbarhet som något modeord längre. Det är ingenting som vi kan välja. Det är inte en väg vi längre kan välja. Det är en väg vi redan har valt. Inte minst inom stålindustrin, gruvindustrin som har gjort enorma satsningar och aviserat jättestora satsningar på omställning. Så att vi får inte lura oss och tro att det här är någonting vi kan diskutera om vi ska ha. Det här händer nu och det går fort. Så att det vi behöver diskutera nu är hur. Vi behöver ha en plan för hur det ska se ut om 10 år och vi behöver göra jobbet med en gång. Och det är inte en fråga om vi gör det utan det är bara en fråga om att vi gör det, vi måste röra oss. Många beslut är fattade, många detaljer återstår att hamna ut. Mycket jobb är kvar. Hur gör vi det på bästa sätt? Den diskussionen kommer vi att behöva föra intensivt den närmaste tiden. Och jag ser fram emot att ni alla vill vara med och delta i den. Tack så mycket.
Härligt, tack Gert. Superintressant och jag tänker att jag har några frågor som jag vill följa upp med. Men jag tror att vi tar dem tillsammans med nästa talare på våran Q&A. Och så påminner jag er som sitter där hemma eller på kontoret som tittar att har ni frågor eller kommentarer på det som Gert precis pratade om, forskningsproppen om CIP 2.0, skriv det i Menti så tar vi upp det och så kanske vi får en liten diskussion på något sätt här på eftermiddagen. Tack så mycket Gert. Du kommer tillbaka lite senare.
Det då. Tack.
On that note, we'll switch over and speak English for a little bit. And now it's time to leave Sweden and join our friend down on the continent. Partnership for research and innovation across Europe is in fact extremely important for the metal industry in Sweden, especially to ensure the sustainable development that Gert was talking about and with this symbol on our jackets. Therefore, I'm very happy to have Milan Elkerbout joining us, research fellow at the Brussels-based think tank CEPS. A warm welcome to you, Milan.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here.
So happy the technique is working for us right now. This is the first speaker we have over Zoom today. Before I hand over to you, Milan, for your presentation, I think it's good for us to clarify for the audience that when you talk about green steel next in your presentation, it's not the same as H2 Green Steel, which is the company that we're going to hear more about later in the conference. That is right, Milan?
Yes, indeed. We mean it more as a general concept of any type of steel that is produced in line with the climate neutrality objectives of the Green Deal.
Yes, and we just thought that would be a great idea to comment on. I'll remind you to ask your questions in Menti, and with that, Milan, the digital floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much again for your kind invitation, and I'm very happy to join you today from Brussels to talk about the Green Steel project. So my name is Milan Elkerbout. I work at CEPS as a research fellow, which is a think tank focused on all areas of EU policy, but also very much climate and energy policy. But up to last summer, I was actually in Stockholm at IVL to work on the Mistra carbon exit project, where we also discussed a lot about the steel industry. So it's a shame I can't join you in person, but happy to still join you digitally then. So quickly about this Green Steel project. It's a European funded research project for DJ research. So it's separate, but not too dissimilar from Horizon projects. And we essentially have three different areas of research. The first one is very technical, if you will, really focusing on the engineering, the technology routes that are available for the steel sector to decarbonize their production processes over the next 3 decades. The second element is then how to finance this, and then it's especially desirable if this can be done through significant private funding, but at least some public funding will also be indispensable there. And finally, EU policy plays an important role, and that's also what I will be talking about, as CEP's role is particularly large on this policy work package. We started at the beginning of last year, and it will run for a few more months now, up until the middle of summer this year. So a little bit of political background, what has informed our project and our discussions with both steelmakers, NGOs, technology providers, etc. It's of course to reach climate neutrality by mid-century, but in the shorter run, and that is something that is very much occupying policymakers' minds over the next year, will be this increased target for 2030, at least minus 55% as agreed in the European Council in December. And this can have quite a significant impact also on the balance between, say, on the one hand, the emissions trading sectors, of which steelmaking is one, of course, and non-ETS sectors such as transport and buildings. And this could really then determine sort of the speed at which industrial sectors are expected to decarbonize. In a more technical sense, a lot of the preparatory work for the European Green Deal was already conducted throughout 2017 and 2018 with the long-term strategy entitled A Clean Planet for All. And this here, the European Commission had some extensive analysis of the different pathways that are available to the European economy. And while there are nuances in the emphasis for different sectors, industrial decarbonization really should be advancing quite rapidly over the next few decades, with the vast majority of the carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions to be eliminated. We're also currently discussing in Brussels an update to the industrial strategy. While this is not exactly hard legislation as the ETSs or some other measures that may be discussed in the summer, it is nevertheless very important for framing the industrial challenge and for setting the boundary conditions for other sort of more harder laws that might be forthcoming in the rest of the year. Carbon pricing, of course, will continue to play a very important role with another revision of the emissions trading system upcoming. The proposal will come in summer, but then we might be discussing it for at least a year or maybe two for the details on how the cap of the system develops, how allocation might need to be transformed, and also carbon leakage risk measures, of which the carbon border adjustment mechanism is a very important one. Finally, there's also the Clean Steel Partnership, which I would like to talk a little bit about, also because the Green Steel project is sort of a research component very much aligned with this larger strategy. But first, maybe as a final bit of context, the most important policy is still the EU ETS, and it has really changed a lot in the last 2-3 years, even in spite of the pandemic that has gripped the world and European economy in the past year. Carbon prices have reached new highs. They finally broke out of the very long-running channel of say 5 to 30 euros that was previously established, and have now set new records at 40 euros. At the same time, there's also a lot of free allocation still available to the sector, but then again, that is also changing from this year onwards with new benchmarks and new allocation rules taking effect. And again, these might again be subject to change when the system is revised again. So then going into the Clean Steel Partnership, it's a larger horizon innovation funding partnership that is intended to make available a lot of additional innovation funding to the steel sector, and then really focused on two aspects. The need for breakthrough technology so that we move beyond incremental efficiency improvements more towards these radical new ways of steel making, either using hydrogen, potentially carbon capture and storage, or much greater electrification at scale. And then to support this, especially in the demonstration stage. So a lot of these breakthrough technologies have already been invented. They've been shown to work at very small scale, but in order to really commercialize them, we still need to take a few extra steps before the technology readiness is developed. And also very importantly, the costs would ideally need to come down. A lot of learning can still be done. And then with lower costs, the competitiveness of green steel would also increase. Nevertheless, there are significant market challenges. There is already the aforementioned carbon leakage risk, but also leakage risk perhaps defined a bit more broadly, in that for whatever reason, if investment is taking place in regions outside of the EU, this may put European producers under pressure. So ultimately, what is really needed then is to have a market for green steel specifically, not just for steel in general. And policy might help to develop this, but for now, it's also really important that these future ways of making steel become more competitive, and that's where the partnership and the funding comes in. It's not the only initiative that's taking place at the EU level. There's also the Innovation Fund, which tries to achieve similar things. But importantly, about half of that fund might also still be spent on renewable energy, energy efficiency, and also importantly on industrial decarbonization beyond the steel sector, so chemical industry, refineries, cement, etc. One interesting innovation, though, of this Clean Steel Partnership is that some money is made available from the European coal and steel community, which was the first step of European integration, started in 1952. So there is, in a way, a nice bit of symmetry there that towards 2050, almost in a time scale of a century, the first real step towards European integration can support the decarbonization of one of the core industrial sectors in Europe. I'd now like to talk a little bit about these technological pathways that are available, and then also the EU role and some of the policy problems that may arise. So for a lot of policymakers, the first option is usually what can we electrify, and there might still be some problems with that, but it is considered very attractive if it is at all possible. For steel, this is the case with electric arc furnaces, but there's also a very important dimension here for the circular economy strategy of the EU, and especially the availability of scraps, which can be used as an input for these electric arc furnaces. On the other hand, to operate them, we need massive amounts of renewable electricity. And we are not, or we as a industry or steel sectors are not the only ones who need a lot of electricity. So what is the best way to do it? Is it directly running electric arc furnaces, or should we take an intermediate step through green hydrogen? Or are there other pathways which should actually be explored, which might include not trying to directly avoid the carbon, but actually capturing it and storing it. And there's also some advances taking place there, especially with Norwegian, British, and some ports in the Low Countries doing a lot more with CCUS infrastructure. Finally, it's also important to keep in mind that the EU, due to all the resource demands of industrial decarbonization in general, is putting a lot of emphasis on resource efficiency, sort of as a counterpart to energy efficiency, with the idea that any ton of steel that no longer needs to be produced would then by definition be the most efficient. However, there are intrinsic limits to this, so primary demand will remain. And what is the business case to actually invest in the climate neutral production methods for this? That is the main political challenge then. So here I've listed a few other policy issues that might arise. I've already talked about the real challenges of everyone wanting low carbon electricity, especially renewables. But for those producing electricity, there's the challenge that they would like to see higher electricity prices to justify their investments, whereas those who consume the electricity, of course, need them to be as low as possible. For carbon pricing, there's also a balance to be struck between having the right level of a carbon price that can incentivize decarbonization versus actually using industrial policies to lower the abatement costs. And that is where the industrial strategy comes in. For green hydrogen, it's a lot about expanding the capacity of electrolysis, but there is also some competition there with other ways to produce hydrogen, potentially, like through methane pyrolysis, or again, carbon capture and storage to create this blue hydrogen. CCS then is also at small scale a proven technology, but not really available yet at scale, and there are still some technological challenges. One of the things to make it really compatible with climate neutrality is that you actually capture at as high a rate as possible, which might come with a little bit of additional energy demand. And finally, there's a lot of financial and funding challenges where policy will need to come up with an answer, because for now, these breakthrough technologies will require a lot of capital and operational expenditures. Some of it will need to be provided by industry itself, but a market is needed in order to allow businesses to do that. And there's also a balance to be struck between EU level funding, which has a bit of a harder constraint, versus member states where state aid can play an important role. So with that, thank you very much, and looking forward to discussing with you.
Thank you so much, Milan. This is very interesting, and I'm sure we got some questions for you. I'm going to invite Gert Nilson back on stage and have a Q&A session together. But I want to start out with one of my own questions here. And you spoke on clean steel partnership, Milan, and I just wanted to know, how is this partnership different from others, from earlier trials, and what does the partnership have that makes it is going to make it a success? Can you say something about that?
So I think what it really tries to do is to aggregate a lot of smaller scale initiatives that might have happened if there wasn't this coordination through the partnership. So it is a form of Horizon Europe funding, which under different names has existed for more than a decade in the EU. But what it really tries to do is achieve more skill, more alignment with other instruments that are available, and therefore have a greater impact with more projects that could be funded.
Sounds like it could be a success. What is the timeline? When do we expect to have something to look at, to read about? Or what is the next step?
Yeah, on a very operational level, I'm not too much involved there, so just want to be upfront about that. But more from a larger policy perspective, the deal on the budget, which establishes the amount of funding that is available under Horizon Europe, is only a few months old. So in that sense, we're at the early stages of the project, and a lot of next steps will be expected to happen then over the next 2 years. And also with the Fit for 55 package coming out of the European Commission over summer, you will see a lot of other pieces of the puzzle that can complement this funding to fall into place.
Great. So I'm going to turn over to one of the questions from the audience, and I think I'm getting more questions too, but I'm going to start out with this one. Is there a steel hype in Europe like the one we see in Sweden right now? Can you say something about that? I thought that was a good question.
I mean, I wouldn't call or use the word hype, perhaps. I mean, steel is the largest industrial ETS sector. It's almost 160 million tons, so it needs significant attention. It's also one that is always on the minds of policymakers. It's a very visible industry. I think it's actually rather encouraging that there has been a lot of announcements in the past year, in spite of the pandemic, because for the 2013, say 2018 period, it was a lot quieter in the industrial policy debate or industrial decarbonization.
Yeah, it's something that Gert also talked about in Swedish before it was your turn to present, and he also said that we're actually in this change, and this is happening right now, and it's very much how we feel in Sweden. I don't know if Gert, if you have a comment on Milan's presentation or question.
Just quickly, I perfectly agree with you that it's great that we have this attention and that we now see the biggest, I would say, the biggest single steel effort research-wise in the EU. And I also think that what you mentioned as the main success factor is that it makes all the little initiatives play in concert, and that's something that we have identified. We talked about Samforsk earlier, and we also heard from the evaluation of our programs that the evaluators stress that we should have more resources to coordinate and to make all the pieces fit in the puzzle. That's really a success factor. So I think we're on the right path. This kind of coordinated effort towards a vision is where every piece makes sense in the big puzzle. That's really, I think, a key to success. So I perfectly agree with Milan.
That's great. And I'm going to follow up with another question, and this one is from someone in the audience, and this is for you, Milan. Will Europe have enough renewable energy to support green steel production in Europe in the future by 2050? What do you think about that?
This is, I think, one of the biggest challenges for the entire Green Deal. It probably is only feasible if there is also serious attention to energy and resource efficiency. If you sometimes look at numbers in countries that have a lot of steel production, and then to move that entire steel production to renewable-based electricity processes, you're sometimes talking about half a country's electricity production. And the chemical industry, which is very important in some countries, and all the other 150 ETS sectors might have similar electricity demand. So you're talking about terawatts of additional capacity. That is a huge challenge, but it is also recognized as being such. So that's perhaps a reason for optimism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and another question here. You had on your slide, it said no market for green steel, and you also mentioned that policy can help here. And what do you mean here? What can policy do to help create a market for green steel?
So just to clarify what I mean with no market, I mean, there's a lot of steel being bought all the time, of course, but if you would advertise it as green steel at a higher cost to also reflect a higher cost, then not everyone may be interested to actually pay that premium. There might be some who are interested in that, but it also then needs to be really clear in the market and for the relevant people making the purchasing decision that it is green steel. So labeling or guarantees of origin can play a role here, but also demand driven by high-end customers for certain products can play a role, or public procurement. But I think one of the key challenges here is that if you look at final products, it's actually quite doable to pay the higher cost of green steel, because the material costs are only a very small part of the total product costs. But that does not mean that it is seen as such by the people making the market decisions to procure the steel. So here is a real challenge for policymakers to bridge that gap.
Yeah, and if we look beyond Europe and think about Sweden, when it comes to making a market out of green steel, do you have any comments about that yet?
We see that the next speaker will actually firmly believes that there is a market for green steel. Although I must say that I don't think this is in conflict with what you say, because still, if we go from a small production to a slightly bigger production, that would still address the high-end buyers as you spoke about, and there's a big step to look at also the whole market paying a premium for green steel. But we do have investors in Sweden, as we will soon know, that firmly believe in a good market for green steel.
Yeah. I think we have time for one last question, and it regards CBAM, CBAM, gränsjusteringsmekanism in Swedish. It's been discussed quite a lot in the media over the last days here in Sweden, and I'm sure in many other countries. As a policy expert, what are your thoughts? How efficient can one of these mechanisms be? Do you have any in-depth comment on that?
It's the most talked about policy probably in a long time. Conceptually, it's a very attractive idea, I think, and a lot of people agree with that, also outside of the EU, because the problem of one region investing massively into climate neutral production and then also facing carbon costs while importers do not have the same. It's easy to understand. At the same time, the design of such a CBAM mechanism can be very complicated because you have to account for all sorts of legal and political difficulties on WTO compatibility, what to do with exports, because export subsidies are even more controversial than protecting against imports, excluding least developed countries, a problem of reshuffling where, for example, even China might already have a little bit of efficient steelmaking, and then they could claim that, well, we're exporting this to the EU and not the high carbon stuff, so please don't apply the CBAM. For this reason, it might be possible that the initial application of such a system is more limited, also apply to very homogeneous sectors, which you could argue steel is one of, but definitely not as much as, for example, cement, and that it would then be expanded over time, also possibly including final products rather than the intermediate types.
Yeah. Yet it looks like you wanted to make a comment on the CBAM too. Do you agree with Milan?
No. I think you covered that. You covered all the whole complexity of those measures. But I agree there. Maybe I would like to say that we are also working on traceability of materials, and that would be, I think, a key component to enabling such a mechanism, such a border trade mechanism. I know there's some questions from the audience and also from our side. Nuclear power, Milan, would that be considered fossil or CO2 low? Yes or no?
It is CO2 low, so I don't think there's much to argue about there, but that doesn't make it green. There's very different opinions on this. So you need to prioritize either the greenhouse gas emissions or have a broader environmental choice, and that can only be taken by people in the European Council, I think.
So it's a priority issue. Okay, thank you.
I think our time is almost up here, and do you have anything further to say, Milan? Are you going to be joining us in the rest of the conference, listening in, or what do you think?
No, I'm definitely very happy to listen what you have to say, and given all the developments in Sweden, even in just the last 6 months or 3 months, it's great that so much progress has been made. So.
Yeah, and you were just in Sweden, so your Swedish you might be able to understand some of the presentation that we do in Swedish too. I hope so. Thank you so much, Milan, for joining us. It was great to have you in the conference.
Thank you very much again.
Thank you. Så, och tack också till dig, Gert. Vi ska ta en liten paus, och när vi återvänder så ska vi prata om det som Gert var inne på. Vi kommer att prata om H2 Green Steel och om vätgas. Så ta en liten paus, fyll på kaffekopparna och så ses vi om en liten stund.